Back-to-back 7-6 campaigns, back-to-back strong recruiting classes, and it looks like a third in a row for James Franklin and Penn State, ranked in the top 15 by most services. We talked some Penn State recruiting with National Signing Day just a couple days away with Nick Polak from Black Shoe Diaries. Nick, this is your first time on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
It is. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is good stuff. I want to get a take from Penn State doing so well again. And we expect at some point this is going to come to fruition on the field. First of all, who are those guys that are firmly entrenched, firm with their commits that you're pretty happy about, that most Penn State fans are pretty psyched about?
Well, the big three guys for this class, kind of the core of the class, is running back Miles Sanders, offensive guard Michael Menet, and defensive end Shane Simmons. Sanders and Simmons have both been committed for quite some time, actually committed last July. So those are pretty familiar names to Penn State fans at this point. Then Michael Menet committed at the end of May of 2015. So all three of those guys have been in the fold for a decent amount of time, and they're all, I mean, there was a little bit of a scare with Miles Sanders with potentially going over to Pitt, but they kind of kicked themselves. They kind of shoved their foot in their mouths there when they got rid of their offensive coordinator. So that didn't come to fruition for them. But it's great for Penn State because Miles Sanders is one of the very best players in this entire recruiting class. He's ranked as the #1 running back on the 247 composite, a 5-star player, just an absolutely dominating running back. He can do it all. He's going to be a ridiculous – he and Saquon Barkley together are going to form a ridiculously talented backfield. And then Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go right to it.
But then Michael Menet is probably the most important commit in this class just because he's a stud offensive lineman who honestly could play day one if they needed to. He probably won't start day one. I would assume that he's starting by the end of the year. Honestly, he's that good. But he is an extreme position of need for Penn State. Obviously, they've had a ton of offensive line struggles the last few years, particularly with the guards. And that's where Menet profiles best. He actually has the versatility to play anywhere on the offensive line, including center. But he profiles best as a college guard, and that's probably where he'll start out. And then Shane Simmons has been one of the most vocal commits for Penn State. He's very active on Twitter and very active recruiter. He's done a nice job of helping get a few other DMV area kids up to Penn State. But he's someone who actually the scouting services were kind of cooling on a little bit before his senior season. He didn't have a great series of camps going into his senior year, but he ripped it up during his senior year, and he played outstanding. And then at the Under Armour All-American game recently, he was fantastic again, and he's someone who's kind of risen back up the boards. Right now on the 247 composite, he's sitting at number 41. So that's 3 top 50 guys that Penn State's kind of hanging their hats on, and those are the big 3 for this class.
Yeah, that's how important the offensive line is. NFL quarterback, explosive running back who burst onto the scene halfway through the season against Ohio State in particular, guys at wideout that I see playing in the league someday, and the offensive line sometimes cause it to unravel against the better defenses. Let's see, we're just 2 days away now. Nick, who are some of those guys that are on the fence that are weighing Penn State against 2 or 3 other schools that you would love to see sign on the dotted line?
So, unfortunately for Penn State, the big names left still on their board are not really trending in their direction. For example, just in about an hour from now, actually, Damar Hamlin will be announcing his college decision. He is currently down to Penn State, Pitt, and Ohio State. It's looking like he's going to be most likely going to Pitt, if not going to Ohio State. Penn State seems to be third in that race. It's not entirely clear. That's just what it feels like. But he's definitely a name to watch out for. Brendan Ferns, inside linebacker from Ohio, is down to Penn State and West Virginia. Things were looking very good for Penn State here until weather caused him to cancel his official visit last weekend. He wasn't able to make it up to State College, and he's at West Virginia was just at West Virginia this past weekend. So that kind of hurt the Nittany Lions not being able to get him on campus again, particularly because his family had been forming a really nice bond with the families of early enrollee Connor McGovern and the Menet family as well. So that definitely hurt Penn State to not get him up there. It's been pretty much a 50-50 race the whole way. With not being able to visit Penn State, I'd probably give West Virginia the edge right now. Aside from that, they're still on the board for Lavert Hill, the cornerback who was committed earlier on in the process, eventually chose to back off on that commitment, but took a surprise official visit to Penn State earlier in the month, or early in January, and has things down to Penn State, Michigan State, and Michigan. Again, it's looking a lot. Chances seem a lot better for Michigan and Michigan State, but Penn State at least got themselves back in the running, which is something not a lot of people saw coming. So honestly, that's kind of an achievement in and of itself at this point. Aside from that, there are definitely a few other guys they're looking at. They're more low-level guys. They just picked up a couple commits in the last 2 days with defensive tackle Antonio Shelton and wide receiver Dae'lun. They still have a few other wide receivers on the board. It's not entirely clear whether or not they want to take another wide receiver. Initially, they were only targeting Trey Nixon out of Florida, ended up actually committing to Ole Miss instead. After he did that, they kind of spread out some other offers. So it's possible they're just going to take Darian and be done at wide receiver. But another name to watch if he does decide to still give Penn State a shot would be Minnesota commit Dredrick Nelson from Florida. He's another name to watch. But at this point, the only other guy that would really be on the board would be Rashad Weaver, who's actually famously now one of the players that Harbaugh told might not have a spot on National Signing Day despite being committed to Michigan. So he's down to Penn State and Pitt, just visited both this past weekend. So we'll see on him.
Nick Polak joining us from Black Shoe Diaries. The offensive line is such a sore spot, that's obvious. But for a team that has the offensive personnel we just addressed, at least last year, don't know about all the defections at this point. But looking at the front seven on defense, extremely strong. It's difficult for me sometimes to surmise how this team's lost 6 games, but I think the offensive line has been that marginal. In regards to the personnel coming back, kind of weigh that against the class. You mentioned the one stud offensive lineman you bring in. Do you think the offensive line has been addressed overall? And those positional needs, do you think that they're being hit on?
I'd say definitely. The big areas of concern for this class were always going to be the offensive line and then the defensive tackle spot, because that's a spot that Penn State's pretty thin on right now on the depth chart. And it's not quite like the offensive line. You can get a defensive tackle and really plug him in right away as a freshman if he's talented enough. They were looking excellent for defensive tackle, but things hit a pretty major snag. At one point, they had 4 defensive tackles committed after Karamo Diabute decided to decommit, is probably heading to Temple. Christian Cologne allegedly had his scholarship pulled, some issues with his high school team. I know he was suspended for a few games down there. And then Michael Dwumfor actually just flipped to Michigan recently. So they went from 4 guys to 1 guy, defensive tackle, real quick. And while that one guy is very good, Ellison Jordan, 4-star player, he's very good. He's not the kind of player who can do absolutely everything at that spot just yet. He's primarily a pass rush specialist from the defensive tackle spot right now. Thankfully, they just picked up the commitment from aforementioned Shelton, which is a good way to recover a little bit. But it's looking like the only other way they'll get a defensive tackle to help with that would be junior college player Tyrell Chavis. Chavis would be a very good addition. It's not clear if his grades are quite good enough to qualify right now, but we'll see. But the offensive line, they definitely addressed. Again, the offensive line, it's not really a quick fix kind of recruiting. They kind of need a few years to get used to the weight training program and the nutrition and all that and get ready to play. But they definitely have 2 guys that could make immediate impacts, which is kind of unheard of on the offensive line. But Michael Menet and Connor McGovern are both guys that could play from day one if need be. And then you have some of the redshirt freshmen from last year will be starting to get ready for this year, like Steven Gonzalez should be fighting for a guard spot. Ryan Bates could be even in line to be the starting center this year. There's definitely the talent from the last 2 years is definitely getting there for the offensive line, and it's coming just in time. It's maybe a year, took a year too long, but it's coming.
Nick Polak joining us from Black Shoe Diaries to break down the Penn State class just a couple days before National Signing Day. Nick, if you joined our channel, we've got bloggers all over the place, all the conferences, but I'm weak in the Big Ten, so I love you jumping on here. That's my heart. That's my country there in the Big Ten. And unfortunately, we're a little weak there, so we appreciate you coming on. Would love to have you come back sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.